Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View, and we're going to be covering a lot of different topics. I thought I'd start out today and really get into the whole issue of the coronavirus and what is happening, because we broadcast today from Dallas, and we're in Dallas County. And yesterday there were 1,114 new coronavirus cases, which made that the 11th straight day in which the count has exceeded 1,000. Now, I bring this up for a couple of reasons. Number one, there is this assumption that we're kind of getting back to the new normal. The new normal is maybe we won't fill out our restaurants exactly. Maybe only a few people be allowed to go to a gym or a hair salon or whatever. But I will make a statement that I can also find being made by the county judge, Clay Jenkins, in which he said just the other day that people are more likely to come in contact with someone with the virus now than when the county's stay-at-home order was in place. Now, he said that, and you might say, well, I don't want to listen to what he has to say. No, okay, let's think this through for just a minute, because I've said the very same thing. Let's go back to March. I think when we first knew there were a few cases of the coronavirus, and we didn't know how many, but we knew that there were maybe, possibly in the entire, let's use Dallas County as an example, probably weren't even 1,000 people that were infected in Dallas County. Okay? That's back in March. Yesterday, they just announced that there were 1,100 new cases, and this has been the 11th straight day. So you are much more likely to run into someone who actually has tested positive, and recognize that these are just the ones where the people said, something's not right. I don't feel well. I'm going to go to a testing facility and see if I have the virus. There are a number of others, as we'll talk about in just a minute, perhaps even a majority of others who actually do have the virus and have very limited symptoms, or they're asymptomatic, or maybe they even have significant symptoms, but they can't get into a car and drive to one of these places, or they just simply think that maybe I'll just get over it. So you recognize in some respects we may only really be dealing with the tip of the iceberg. And right now there are 34,000 confirmed cases in Dallas County. Now, again, some of you are not in Dallas County, so you're saying, well, that doesn't relate to my county. Well, no, it probably relates in different percentages, but again, right now in Dallas County, 13 out of every 1,000 residents actually have the virus. You've had 457 deaths. Now, again, I see people launching on that and saying, look, we've had more people die of the common flu that comes through. I've looked at the numbers for 2018 and 2019, and we've had more people die of the flu, and that's just the common flu. So this one's no different than that. Oh, yes, it's very different than that. And I think any kind of look at this can help you understand. Now, one of the things that Kelly Shackelford likes to say whenever he's on Friday is people forget that the reason we did the lockdown was to make sure that we did not stress the healthcare system. But right now, there have been 757 emergency room visits for COVID-19 symptoms, which represent a third of all the visits. So if you go to an emergency room right now, it is very likely that somebody else sitting there, somebody being treated there, actually has the coronavirus as well. And there are 809 people so far that have been hospitalized with the virus. Completely below, at the moment, what would be stressing the system. But if you want to travel from here to Houston and see one of the bigger hot spots in the state of Texas, or if you want to go to the mega hot spot, Miami, Florida, you will see that we have exceeded this rather dramatically. All this to say is that right now there's kind of a, okay, we went through the lockdown, now we're behind it, the deaths are dropping somewhat. So everybody's going back to normal, and that's why we're getting what some people say is a second wave. I've also quoted from you and from some other individuals that say, you know, it's quite possible this is just the first wave that never really kind of made it through the population. But let's also recognize that not only is it likely that you will more likely run into somebody with a coronavirus, indeed, the virus itself seems like it might be more infectious. Now, again, just a little bit of biology here, not going to be too complicated here. When an individual coughs, talks, and here's one of the things that really was surprising we found out. When you're like in a choir singing, there was one choir up in Washington where 87% of the people in the choir got the virus because you're really projecting at this point. So coughing, talking, singing, breathing, there are little droplets. Many of those are affected by gravity, so they fall out. But some of the aerosols continue. You contain, maybe breathe in a few of those. And then the virus actually can then, hopefully, if it's trying to infect you, and hopefully not if you actually have a mask or if it goes down your throat rather than in your lungs, won't infect you, but it goes to a part in your lung, which, again, these are AC2 receptors, and this little sticky hook on the coronavirus hooks onto those receptors. Now, in the past, those receptors, and though we're certainly able to connect, but it has been interesting that the virus itself have these little hooks. And the best way to illustrate this, if you think about Velcro, one side of the Velcro, you got just kind of like all sorts of fibers. The other side, you have something like little hooks. And imagine if when you're trying to put your Velcro together, the hooks on the right side just keep breaking off. Well, that's been kind of what has been happening up until now with this particular virus. Some of those particular cells, which are called SARS-CoV-2, would actually break off. And so, interestingly enough, there's been a mutation, and it's at this particular spot called the D spot, in which the D changes to a G. For those of you that remember your biology, it actually is just a substitute of one nucleotide from adenine to guanine, and that, for some reason, now makes those hooks stronger. So when they have looked at the difference between the original virus that came out of Wuhan and the one that seems to be now taking over here in the United States and around the world, those tend to not break off. Those hooks tend not to break off. And I reported the other day that they found in cell cultures that they were 10 times more infectious. Now, a new report says maybe more 8 times. But the big question is, does this suggest that what happens in the laboratory, showing that it's more infectious, happen out in the day-to-day world? Because after all, what happens in a petri dish is not exactly what happens when we're going about our lives, but there's some suggestion maybe that it is. All that to be a really kind of technical talk to simply say this is a time when you need to be more careful, and yet there might be a mindset that say, oh, it's all over, I didn't catch it, I'm doing fine, and so I'll just go about my day-to-day. I think Clay Jenkins and some of the other people that have said it may be even more likely that you can get infected probably is very true for some very good scientific and medical reasons. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The lockdowns during the pandemic may have been helpful for our physical health, but they have not been so helpful for our mental health. One example can be seen in the dramatic increase in drug overdose deaths. The database constructed by the Washington Post found a troubling correlation between the lockdowns and drug overdose deaths. Of course, a correlation doesn't mean causation, but I think we can reasonably infer the connection between the two. Even if you assume that drug use during the lockdowns has remained constant, the writers at the newspaper still come up with two reasons why drug overdose deaths have increased. First, the pandemic and lockdowns have disrupted the drug supply chains. This might have led to more and more drug users to taking more deadly synthetic drugs. Now, the second reason is even darker and more disturbing. You know, in a world of isolation and social distancing, many of these sequestered people are taking drugs alone. That means it is less likely that there might be someone else around who could call 911. So drug use in the midst of social isolation has become deadly. Of course, there's really every reason to believe that drug use did increase during the lockdowns. People were home alone with little to do. Their jobs used to provide structure and purpose. It also provided them with earned income and self-esteem. Many of the people at home lost their jobs, and so it's easy to see why more isolated people might turn to drugs. So when we look at this, increased drug use and increased drug overdose deaths are an important factor to keep in mind when politicians call for another lockdown. There are a number of mental and medical costs associated with lockdowns that are often ignored in the political debates and discussions. There is indeed a deadly cost to social isolation. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let us spend another few minutes just on the pandemic real quickly, and especially as it relates to the schools. Then we'll move on to some other topics because there is so much to talk about today. But for people saying, well, you know, the death rate isn't that bad, here is an interesting story that just came out. Some Arizona and Texas counties are running out of space in their morgues and have put out calls for refrigerated trucks in which to store bodies and help take some of the pressure off of the local medical examiners' offices. Remember when that happened in New York? Well, it's now happening at least in a few places in Texas and Arizona. And many people were predicting that as we began to open up the country, you would actually begin to see that there would be a rise in infections. But at the time, you weren't getting a rise in deaths. They were actually declining. But now, after a longer incubation period, we are seeing a rise in death. So again, just one of those stories to remind us that we don't want to put a stress on the healthcare system, but in some places they're already calling for refrigerated trucks in order to store the bodies because it's starting to overwhelm the system. And again, that was the reason for the lockdown in the first place. That was the reason for the shelter in place. And here we find ourselves in a couple of places in the country where that's happening again. One of the other arguments I have heard people say is, look, most people recover from the virus. First of all, 8 in 10 probably have such mild symptoms or in some cases no symptoms. So this isn't that devastating. True. But let's now look at the other
20% in round numbers. You have, it's kind of 10 and 10. You have 10 that have more significant issues and sometimes have to go to emergency rooms, have to go to hospitals, and then others of that other last 10% have to go maybe even in ICU or then eventually succumb to the disease. And so there is a very significant amount of study that's been done, not just on what's called the mortality, the death rate, but the morbidity, the effect that the disease has on your health. And so let me quote from this study on heart scans that were done of COVID-19 patients have revealed more than half had some form of damage. Okay, let me dig into the study a little bit. And again, I recognize most of you don't have a science degree or medical degree, but let's see if we can kind of work our way through it. This was a study done, interestingly enough, from people that had contracted the disease and had significant symptoms from about 69 different countries in 6 continents. And then what they did was they used what is called an echocardiogram. That's kind of an ultrasound scan of the heart. This research was done between April 3rd and the 20th. Of course, now some of these papers are now starting to come out after they've been described, peer-reviewed, and the rest. This one shows up in the European Heart Journal, Cardiovascular Imaging. And they found that of those patients, 55%, are you ready? 55%, more than a majority, had abnormalities in their scan, and 1 in 7 of those participants had what researchers described as severe abnormalities, according to the patients that were actually investigated and according to the paper that appeared in this journal. Now, on average, let's recognize again, I think it was the median age was 62. So these are older individuals. About 70% were male. Now, that gets back to something just a minute ago that has been kind of interesting, because it's the way in which your lungs with your ACE receptor, the men oftentimes have more of those. So in some respects, this particular disease affects men more than women, seemingly. Also affects older rather than younger. And so there are all sorts of variations that we're starting to notice. But nevertheless, on average, the participants in these scans, average age 62, 70% male, 60% of the scans were performed in a critical care setting, such as the ICU unit or the emergency room, while the others were carried out in kind of a general medicine setting. This could be wards or things like that. And so, again, you can see that overall they concluded that these abnormal scans were more likely to be with older patients who also maybe had some underlying heart problems. What, again, it suggests is that even when you survive the disease, and so there's no mortality, you still are affected maybe for the rest of your life in the issue of what I call morbidity. So those are all the reasons why we should still be paying attention to this. But on the other hand, there's been this growing question, should we reopen the schools? Yesterday, I spent some time talking about that. There's another good piece that just came out here with the Wall Street Journal, the case for reopening the schools. And so, again, the question was, everything else about the coronavirus has been politicized in America, so why not return to school as well? That's the depressing state of play that comes from this particular author, Rich Gracili, about the comment by the president, Donald Trump, and also by the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, in terms of actually going to the schools. The evidence, he says, scientific, health, and economic, argues overwhelmingly for schools to open in the fall. Start with the relative immunity of young children to the disease, which should reassess and reassure parents. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 30 children under the age of 15 have died from COVID-19. In a typical year, 190 children die from the flu, 436 from suicide, 625 from homicide, 4,114 from unintentional deaths such as drowning. Only 2 children under the age of 18 had died in Chicago, fewer than were killed in shootings in a recent weekend. In New York City, 3 hundreds of a percent of children under the age of 18 have been hospitalized for COVID, and 7.5 and 1 million have died. The death rate for those over 75 is more than 2,200 times, I should say, higher than those for the 18. The point he's making here is if you look at the so-called death rate or even the mortality or morbidity rate, young children seem to be almost immune to COVID-19. And when you look at the few deaths that have taken place, this is very significantly below even those that would die normally from the flu and maybe had other congenital issues as well. And so the point they're making is that if you look at what we talked about yesterday, what isn't happening when kids are at home? They're really not studying. They're not really doing a great deal. This goes on to talk about some other issues, and maybe after the break I'll get into that a little bit more because, of course, it also points out that millions of parents really can't go to work if their children can't attend school. So we're affecting the workforce. We're affecting the educational issues. Kids are getting further and further behind. You always have, of course, what's called the summer slump, where you have to spend the first month, usually of August or September, just trying to get them back to where they were maybe in May. But now, since they have really been out since March, it might take all the way to December to get them to where they need to be. And so there are long-term effects, not the least of which are the social effects, the emotional effects, and all sorts of other issues of not having kids in school. And as I pointed out yesterday, the American Academy of Pediatrics said missing school can have serious consequences for child health and well-being, particularly for children with disabilities or with special health care needs. So again, we're almost every day getting the American Academy of Pediatrics, the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics saying, we've got to do something. We just can't keep doing this. But what has been so interesting is Los Angeles says we're going to keep the schools closed. And this is one of the articles I've posted because you have to wonder if this is really true, because they said we will only think about reopening the schools if, first of all, we defund the police and pass Medicare for all and actually implement a ban on new charter schools. You just can't believe this stuff. And this is what's coming from some of those individuals. And I decided to post it, if for no other reason than when I first read it, I thought this has to be the Babylon or maybe the Onion or one of the others. I mean, this has got to be a parody, and apparently not. You know, we're not going to open up these schools unless we can get some of these liberal progressive ideas implemented within our school district, probably even implemented within this country. People are losing their minds, I think. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we'll get into some of the arguments being used right now, because as you probably have figured out, some people really just are not living in the world of reality. And boy, this last half hour, I've tried to at least talk about the reality of the pandemic. Let's come back with more right after this.
The year 2020 has been filled with problems, or let's just call them challenges. Before I get into that, we want to thank you. We just passed the end of our fiscal year, and many stepped up in a very big and sacrificial way, showing just how much they believe that Point of View is needed as we head into the last half of this year. And that's where our new challenge comes in. At the last minute, a friend stepped up with a surprising $50,000 matching challenge, and listeners matched it. But after that, yet another friend, knowing how important this year is, put down another $50,000 challenge, and because we were so close to deadline, said we could extend it just a bit to July 15th. As our nation deals with so many issues, make sure that Point of View can be a strong voice for truth by helping us complete that second match. Double your investment by giving at pointofview.net/time or call 1-800-347-5151. The clock is ticking. Pointofview.net/time. That's TIME. Pointofview.net/time or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Love to know if you think it is time to reopen the schools or whether you think this virtual learning is working well. Next hour, we're going to have Bob Lepine with us. We'll be talking about his book, Love Like You Mean It. But then after about a half an hour with him, I'll come back to this issue because the first two articles we've posted on the website today, one from the Wall Street Journal, Case for Reopening the Schools, the second one on defund the police and Medicare for all, or we won't open the schools. And I had to post that one because I honestly, when I first saw that, it said, oh, come on, that's not what they said. Oh, yes, it is. As a matter of fact, you can go find the research paper that makes a longer list. Let me give you that list real quickly because it came out in a paper just the other day. Let's see, what is it? United Teachers of Los Angeles Union called for the defunding of police, a moratorium on new charter schools, something we talked about yesterday, new wealth taxes on California's millionaires and billionaires, and Medicare for all at the federal level in a research paper issued, of course, on Thursday. And, of course, they also called for an additional $500 billion in additional federal assistance to K through 12 schools. That's a $500 billion, you know, $500 billion. These people have lost their minds, which is why I'm going to get to this article, which I wasn't going to, but it sort of just led into it. And this came out the other day. Seton Motley talks about just how people on the left, and I want to make a distinction, as we have so often here. Dennis Prager helped us understand the difference between the hard left and liberals. What's happening now, interesting enough, and Ben Shapiro has been writing about this and talking about this, is that it used to be that the hard left and liberals would always criticize conservatives or even moderates by saying, you don't agree with this, so that means you're racist, xenophobic, homophobic, whatever. And so it was always, they sort of made their uneasy alliance. But your typical liberal was the kind of person that said, look, I may disagree with your view, but I want to defend your right to say it. That's a liberal view, which actually is something that conservatives hold to as well. The hard left Marxist view says you do not have a right to say it, and I'm not going to give you a forum for it, and I'm going to use a cancel culture to destroy you if you ever do say anything like that. And so that's what we're talking about here. And this article is all about the fact that as we see some of this unfolding, first on the college campuses, and I've got all sorts of little booklets we've written about what's been happening on the campus. We've done whole Outlook articles on this. We saw first on the campus, now we're seeing it in the communities, we're seeing it in some of the political figures, we're seeing it out on the streets. And so, again, Seton Motley says, you know, we the people are currently awash in insanity. Nothing makes sense. No one is behaving rationally. It's because the left is currently running things. They have been rapidly advancing, and no one seems to be doing much to stop them. That sounds like a Tucker Carlson comment, which he's almost every night been talking about. And the point he's making is that those people on the left, they have to live in a world of anti-reality because there is a sense in which if you believe in cause and effect, supply and demand, if you believe in human sinfulness and a number of other things, you're going to come to something that's going to look more like a conservative political philosophy. Not always, but I mean, sooner or later, reality is going to hit up against you and you're going to go, okay, I was maybe assuming some things about human nature, assuming certain things about the economy, certain things about logic that just aren't right. And so in some respects, the more you get down the, if you will, the rabbit hole of the left, the more you realize it has to deny reality. Because, I'm going back now to his piece, reality is antithetical to their worldview. Nothing in which the left believes works in reality. Human beings don't behave that way, the way the left thinks that people should. Humans make reality, which is why the left oftentimes even looks like it's anti-human. And the examples he uses are pretty amazing. He says the left can't fit reality's square peg into their round hole. So lots and lots of hammering is attempted, but squares don't fit in circles, never ever will. And the left, because of that, then becomes totalitarian, because the left is inherently totalitarian, and it almost has to be in order to force you to believe things that you know aren't really true. And because reality and we humans don't voluntarily comply, then we must be made to comply. So then he gives a lot of examples. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to something else, but he uses one example from the New York Democratic Mayor Andrew Cuomo, who forced senior facilities to actually house thousands of individuals that had the coronavirus. We've heard Dr. Merrill Matthews talk about why, because it was seen as maybe anti-discriminatory if you were, or discriminatory if you were to keep people out. So in some respects, we increased the number of deaths in there because we didn't want somebody to be labeled as COVID-19, so we simply put them in places where they shouldn't have been. He says the left moves to defund the police, and of course we've seen this as well. And then you have, he's got all sorts of quotes from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but we'll pass on that. Then you also have to tear down statues, but even statues of, for example, a black former slave liberator, abolitionist hero, Frederick Douglass. You have to tear down the statue of the author of the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln. You have to force nuns to pay for abortions and contraception. You have to force a private bakery to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding. And he goes through this long, long list, and in every particular case you see, if you will, the totalitarian inclination. And the reason so much of that is because you have to force people to deny reality, because reality does not reinforce some of these hard left ideas. So, if nothing else, just one more issue to put on the table. And something that is very related is today there was a very good piece by Dennis Prager, who's been on the program with us before, both by phone and in studio. 5 arguments against America is a racist country. And I'll just pick out 1 or 2 of those. But one of those he actually wrote about yesterday, and that is, number 1, if there is so much racist in America, and if racism really is so rampant as we are supposedly told that it is, why are there so many false claims of racism and outright race hoaxes? And yesterday's column, which actually goes through, I think he had 10 different examples of these fake hate crimes. And that one resonated with me because over the weekend I came up with 2 more that aren't on his list. These things just proliferate like rabbits in your backyard. I mean, it is amazing. Let's take this one. This was a Texas A&M student who made the headlines because he said he found a racist note on the windshield of his car. The note said, "All lives matter, you don't belong here," and it contained, of course, the N-word. You know where I'm probably going with this, because then he told, first of all, people on Facebook and then various news outlets that he had seen things like this happen across the country, but never thought that it would happen to him. So then the president of Texas A&M offered $1,200 to anyone providing information leading to the arrest of the person that posted the note. And then statements about all acts of racism are irreconcilable with the values we uphold here at Texas A&M. Those who promote hate, discrimination, disrespect are not welcomed at this institution. And, of course, you know where I'm taking this one, because last week the police closed the investigation because they had every reason to believe that the accuser was the one that wrote the notes. Now, they had no cameras actually on the car, but they had cameras. Again, if you're going to perpetuate a hoax, you might want to think about this. There were other cameras, other places, so they could see anybody who was even walking near his car. And there's only one person that walked near the car after he left the car, and that was this individual by the name of Isaiah Martin. He did it to himself. Now, if that is bad enough, because we expect college students to be stupid, sometimes, and they are. But this one comes from the commissioner in Oregon, a county commissioner in Oregon, who claimed that he found a racist letter in his mailbox. And again, this was, where he was making all sorts of pious statements about, I've lived a life full of obstacles and challenges, including racism. There's no tolerance for this. And Mr. Lopez, now claiming that because he's Hispanic, got this. He said, I feel no resentment about this. But again, you know where we're going with this one, because the police said, our investigation shown that Mr. Lopez wrote the letter himself, made false statements to the police and on social media. The end result is a verbal and written admission by Mr. Lopez that the letter was fabricated. They went on, by the way, to take a couple of shots, and that's to say the amount of time spent on this fictitious claim meant time lost on other matters and created increased and incredible tension in our community that was not justifiable. So one of the arguments that I think against a racist country is the demand for racism is very high, the supply pretty low, which is why we get so many of these fake hate crimes. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View.
your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, for a few more minutes, let me just mention we have not posted this Dennis Prager column, and maybe I will in the future because I could expand it into some other areas. But the point I made just a minute ago is that he said, if there is so much racism in America, why are there so many false claims of racism and outright race hoaxes? And he offered, I guess it was 15 examples in his column yesterday, which you can probably find. But he said there were no racist hoax when America really was racist. As he also points out, there were probably no anti-Semitic hoaxes in the 1930s Germany when it was rampant. When anti-Semitism is rampant, you don't need a hoax. Although there may have been some there just to kind of reinforce that even more so. So you need real hoaxes when you need false hoaxes, I guess a better way to say it, when the real thing is hard to find. And that is the case. I mean, this is amazing. Ever since Jussie Smollett, you'd think there would be fewer people engaging in these hoaxes. And I just gave you two from the weekend that I just happened to find. And some things I'm not even looking for it. They just surface, in a Facebook post or a Twitter post. And one is from an individual that actually is a student. One is from an individual that is a political official in Oregon. And I'm sure there are all sorts of others that didn't even make the news. He goes on to say a couple other things. In addition to that, another argument against America's racist is the constant reference to slavery. If there was a great deal of racism in America, he says, there'd be no reason to invoke slavery in the Confederacy. And then he takes us, of course, to the 1619 Project that the New York Times, he says, has been a leader in racist dishonesty. And then goes on in another piece, I was talking about the reliance on lies, because if you have listened to me talk about this, or if you even type in the 1619 Project in any of my Viewpoints commentaries, when it first came out, I raised questions, giving you quotes from some of the most eminent historians, people that probably wouldn't agree theologically or politically with much of what we say here on Point of View, who nevertheless were just appalled at some of the things in the 1619 Project. And then more recently pointing out that when they gave the Pulitzer Prize to this project and to the lead author, there were even people that would, again, disagree with almost everything we say on this program, like columnist Andrew Sullivan, a homosexual activist, who said this may be the first time the Pulitzer Prize has ever been given to a particular work that had to be completely removed and had to be completely revised, because two of the biggest lies of the 1619 Project are that the real cause of the American Revolution was slavery, which is just patently false in so many different ways, and that slavery made America rich. And so he goes on to talk about some others. For example, the large African immigration into the United States, nearly 2 million black Africans, more than 1 million blacks from the Caribbean have immigrated here just in the last 2 decades. Why would they move if they're to this country if they're convinced that it's systemically racist and all those kinds of things? And then just the whole issue of the so-called microaggressions. When you don't have people that are really aggressive, then you have to fall back on racist microaggressions, Orwellian doublespeak, and all the rest. And so, anyway, in typical fashion, Dennis Prager has taken on some of these issues, and if you're just at least open-minded at all, you might read the piece, because I thought it was a reminder and maybe a good explanation for why we see such a rash of these hate crime hoaxes, and there are whole websites dedicated to them. And why would you have so many people doing it? And I think, I hate this to sound crass, but it really is the case. When your supply of actual racist incidents is relatively low, and the demand to show that this is a racist country is very high, you're going to get, first of all, people calling anything they dislike racist and misusing the word. And number two, you're going to get a lot of these fake hate crimes, and that's exactly what we've seen unfolding. As a program note, let me just mention that yesterday from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock, we had a very good interview, I thought, with Jim Dennison, Dr. Jim Dennison, because we'd had a glitch with one of the satellite feeds. Some of you may not have heard it. I would imagine most of you did, but if you did not, or you just happened to not be tuning in yesterday, I would certainly commend it to you, because also if you go to that page, And by going to the website, you can click on Site Navigation and then Shows. So you can go to yesterday's show, which would be Monday. Then you can click on July 13th. You will see that we have posted both his very good piece on what does the Bible say about racism and what does the Bible say about removing statues, as well as another piece on two opposing narratives on the issue of race in America. So those are just a couple of resources I thought I might make available to you since it came yesterday. If you go to the website today, you're going to see the information we're going to have with Bob Lepine, and then we'll also have a focus on this whole idea of racism and lamenting, a great book called Weep With Me, so we'll get into that in just a minute. But my Viewpoints commentary today really connects up, I think, very significantly to the conversation we just had a few minutes ago about the schools, because I point out that the lockdowns during this pandemic may have been helpful to our physical, maybe even our medical health, but they have not been very helpful to our mental health. And a database that was constructed by the Washington Post found a really troubling correlation between lockdowns and drug overdose deaths. So if you go to the website, you'll know that Karen, who posted this commentary, also has a graph that just shows the number of deadly overdose deaths that have increased dramatically compared to last year. And so in some respects, if you even assume that the lockdowns have not changed anything and drug use has been at the same constant level, which I doubt, but let's just start with that. Let's assume that people are using drugs during the lockdown at the same rate they were using them last year. You can still see that the writers in the newspaper came up with two reasons why the increase in drug overdose deaths. And that is, first of all, the pandemic and the lockdown disrupted supply chains, including drug supply chains, which might have led more and more people to actually take more deadly synthetic drugs. The second reason, even more dark and disturbing, is that in this world of isolation and social distancing, these sequestered people were taking the drugs alone. And that means there was not someone around to maybe call 911 if there was an overdose. But I think there's any good reason to suspect that indeed drug use has increased during those lockdowns, during this time of social isolation, because people are home alone, little to do. Their jobs provide them with structure and purpose. Now they don't have them. Provides them with income, which they now don't have. Provides them with self-esteem, which now is being affected. Many lost their jobs. I think there's every reason to believe that the drug use has increased. And while that applies to mostly adults, it also applies to some of these teenage kids and is, again, just another argument for let's open the schools. As dangerous as it might be for the possibility of a virus that could spread through an elementary school or middle school or high school, it's better than leaving them at home, kidding ourselves that this virtual learning experience is really working when it's obviously not, and also forcing a lot of parents to stay at home because their kids are at home. So there are just all sorts of reasons to reopen the schools, even though right now even that has been politicized, because as soon as the president or even the Secretary of Education said that should happen, the hue and cry from the other side has been intense. But let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to spend some time talking with our good friend Bob Lepine. We've known him for decades, and I'm just thrilled that he has a new book out, Love Like You Mean It, and really a diary and a heart of marriage based on 1 Corinthians 13. Great passage, great book, and I think you'll enjoy the conversation. All that coming up right after this.
The year 2020 has been filled with problems, or let's just call them challenges. Before I get into that, we want to thank you. We just passed the end of our fiscal year, and many stepped up in a very big and sacrificial way, showing just how much they believe that point of view is needed as we head into the last half of this year. And that's where our new challenge comes in. At the last minute, a friend stepped up with a surprising $50,000 matching challenge, and listeners matched it. But after that, yet another friend, knowing how important this year is, put down another $50,000 challenge, and because we were so close to deadline, said we could extend it just a bit to July 15th. As our nation deals with so many issues, make sure that Point of View can be a strong voice for truth by helping us complete that second match. Double your investment by giving at pointofview.net/time or call 1-800-347-5151. The clock is ticking. Pointofview.net/time. That's TIME. Pointofview.net/time or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View, and we're going to spend a little bit of time, first of all, talking about marriage in a way that I think you're going to find very helpful. Then we're going to get into some of the issues in the news. A couple of articles I've posted, the case for reopening the schools, kind of look at that issue once again, as we did a little bit yesterday. And in the next hour, we're going to get into, once again, a topic that we've addressed a number of times, and that is the issue of racial reconciliation. So there are lots of topics that we're going to get into, and I hope that you will be with us for the entire 2 hours of the broadcast. And if you'd like to join us, that number 1-800-351-1212. But you think about this, millions of young people, men and women, stand before their friends and their family, pledging their lifelong love to each other. They may not know what they're getting themselves into, and sometimes they will quote from 1 Corinthians 13, and I thought that it might be good to really focus on a book that takes that and breaks it down and helps you understand how to apply those principles. So whether you're a young person heading to the altar, whether you're an individual that has just gotten married, or whether you're like some of us old folks around the table that need maybe a 20,000-mile wheel alignment, I think you're going to benefit from this new book by Bob Lepine, Love Like You Mean It, The Heart of a Marriage That Honors God. The foreword by Gary Thomas, who's been on the program with us as well. We have information about Bob Lepine and, of course, the group that he has been with since 1992. He has, of course, served as the co-host of the nationally syndicated radio program Family Life Today, individual that we used to know from KSLR, that goes way, way back, and also the teaching pastor at Redeemer Community Church. This book just came out last week. We have information about it so that you can maybe find it in your local bookstore, but also so you can order it online. And Bob Lepine, welcome back to Point of View.
Kerby, it is great to be with you and to hear the Point of View theme music again. It's been a while since I don't get it here in Little Rock, but it's nice to hear you and nice to hear Point of View. How long Point of View been on the air?
Since 1972, and I've been doing it since 1986. And so anyway, you can see there's a little bit of longevity. Not to mention, I remember being with Dennis Rainey back in about 1991 or 92, just before you came there, and we were doing some practice programs. So I remember some of that as well. So again, congratulations for the incredible impact that Family Life Today has had all these years.
Well, thank you. It's been a real privilege to get to do what I've been able to do for the last 28 years, and grateful to hear about the impact that the ministry has had on the lives of so many listeners, just as you are, because I know the same is true for Point of View listeners.
Well, let's get into your book because, again, I mentioned that so often when I'm at a funeral or a church, a marriage, a wedding, whatever it might be, we will hear people quoting from 1 Corinthians 13. And really, in some respects, that's what this book is all about. You break down some of these ideas of love is patient and love is kind and love is humble and generous, and really help us understand this. And a lot of people, Bob, might think, well, do we need another marriage book? Well, one of the things I like about your book is there are other people that look at problems in marriage and then try to look for biblical answers. You start with the biblical and then say, how would it apply to marriage? And so in some respects, your book is fairly unique in that regard.
Well, and that's, I wanted to dive deep into this passage because we've heard it so many times. It kind of becomes background noise in our heads, and it sounds like romantic poetry when we hear somebody start to say love is patient and love is kind, and we kind of drift off into this dream state. And you know this, 1 Corinthians 13 was written as a rebuke to a church, the Corinthian church. They were devoid of love, and Paul comes along and he says, your lack of love is an impedance to the gospel. And he rebukes them and says, this is what love looks like. And so it's kind of a scolding. And I remember reading it one day and thinking, we talk about this in general, but what if you applied each of these principles to the marriage relationship? Because that's our central loving relationship for most of us in life. And that was where the idea for this book was born many years ago. And it's been a great labor of love for me to work on this over the last year.
Well, and again, like I said, it just came out about a week ago, and people should be able to find it. It's a B&H Publishing, and of course, they can go to, we have a link to familylifetoday.com. Of course, we also have a link to the book, and they can look for it in the bookstore. But as you mentioned, context is everything, because what precedes this is all about spiritual gifts. And it's kind of wasteful if you aren't using your spiritual gifts with love. But let's get into the chapter on an odd place to begin. Love is patient. You learn a lot about patience when you, first of all, get married. You learn about patience even more when you raise a family of kids, right?
You do learn a lot about patience, because patience is born in adversity. That's where we don't have to worry about being patient when life is good and things are going our way. It's when things aren't going our way that patience is given birth to. And stop and think about this. If you got a room full of 100 people and you said, I just want you to write down the first word that comes to mind when you think of love. I would guess that in a room of 100 people, patience would not be on that list. And yet that's where the Apostle Paul starts when he starts describing love in 1 Corinthians 13. It's the first thing he says about it. And the word patience in our old King James Bibles, there was a different word there. It was the word long-suffering. Mm-hmm. So patience means that we endure, that when things get hard, when we're in a position where we're suffering, we're supposed to bear it. Now, I want to be careful here. I don't think that's talking about physical abuse. I don't think it's talking about it. It's not loving to allow someone to be an abuser. The loving thing to do is to step in and bring help to that person who is caught in a sinful pattern. But when we are in situations where we're facing minor inconveniences or even major struggles, what love does is it says, okay, I'm not going anywhere. We're going to figure out how to deal with this together, and I will bear some of the weight, some of the suffering that comes with adversity in a marriage relationship.
Again, the book is entitled Love Like You Mean It, The Heart of a Marriage That Honors God. About 200 pages and 10 chapters. And when we come back from the break, I thought, Bob, we might talk a little bit about how to use this, because you have this block areas where it says talk together, and you have a series of questions that couples can use. And I would love to put this book in the hands of some of these starry-eyed kids that sometimes come to us and say, we just love each other, we want to get married, and say, okay, but you need to kind of have a chance to think through and talk through some of these issues, and taking them to a passage that they might even use in their wedding ceremony would have a lot more meaning if we put this book in their hands. So when we come back, we've looked at this whole idea of love is patient. Maybe get into a couple more. Love is kind. Certainly love is honest and generous, and a few others. And again, this is a book that has just come out earlier this month, and I think you'll be able to find it in your local bookstore. But if not, we've made it very easy for you to get it in paperback or Kindle. And Bob Lepine, you can't do much better than Dennis Rainey and Bob Lepine and all the great work they've done over the years there at the Family Life Today radio ministry. And you can go to, of course, familylifetoday.com to find out more. Let's take a break. We will continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The lockdowns during the pandemic may have been helpful for our physical health, but they have not been so helpful for our mental health. One example can be seen in the dramatic increase in drug overdose deaths. The database constructed by the Washington Post found a troubling correlation between the lockdowns and drug overdose deaths. Of course, a correlation doesn't mean causation, but I think we can reasonably infer the connection between the two. Even if you assume that drug use during the lockdowns has remained constant, the writers at the newspaper still come up with two reasons why drug overdose deaths have increased. First, the pandemic and lockdowns have disrupted the drug supply chains. This might have led to more and more drug users to taking more deadly synthetic drugs. Now, the second reason is even darker and more disturbing. You know, in a world of isolation and social distancing, many of these sequestered people are taking drugs alone. That means it is less likely that there might be someone else around who could call 911. So drug use in the midst of social isolation has become deadly. Of course, there's really every reason to believe that drug use did increase during the lockdowns. People were home alone with little to do. Their jobs used to provide structure and purpose. It also provided them with earned income and self-esteem. Many of the people at home lost their jobs, and so it's easy to see why more isolated people might turn to drugs. So when we look at this, increased drug use and increased drug overdose deaths are an important factor to keep in mind when politicians call for another lockdown. There are a number of mental and medical costs associated with lockdowns that are often ignored in the political debates and discussions. There is indeed a deadly cost to social isolation. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Bob Lepine as we talk about his book, Love Like You Mean It, The Heart of a Marriage That Honors God. About 200 pages, B&H Publishing, and you can find it perhaps in your local bookstore, but we have information about that on our website, as well as a link to Family Life Today. Bob, we mentioned, of course, if you brought 100 people together and asked them what characteristic would they use to define love, patience probably wouldn't be on the list. I suspect that at least among some of those individuals, the next one might, kindness, because we do sort of recognize that kindness oftentimes goes with love, and especially sometimes as we are trying to win each other so that we could get married, oftentimes that's the time in which we show the greatest amount of kindness. So what can we learn from 1 Corinthians 3, verse 4?
Well, I think it's important to note that love and kindness do belong in the same circle. You can't call somebody who is an unkind person a loving person. That just doesn't work. But I think so many of us think of kindness, and what we really think of is niceness. And there's a difference between being nice and being kind. A nice person is somebody who is polite or who is genteel or who they'll bring a nice atmosphere into the room. A kind person is somebody who is proactively seeking the good of another person. And so kindness is more than simply Mr. Rogers being nice. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not trying to slander Mr. Rogers because I think he was trying to proactively bring goodness into the lives of children. But I think we have to understand that's what real kindness is. The formula for kindness is when somebody says, your good is my goal.
Yes.
For you to thrive, I will sacrifice in order for you to thrive. That's a kind person. And I think we got to look beyond just somebody who's pleasant and look for somebody who is aggressively seeking the good of others.
And again, that's something in terms of marriage counseling that's important because it gets back to some of the scriptural principles of giving up your rights so that you can serve another. And so I love that. And it kind of fits with the next one that we have here. It's not about me. Love is humble. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant. Humility is something that is in short supply sometimes in certain areas. You can go into business offices and corporate executives, and humility's not there. You can go to Capitol Hill and not see a whole lot of humble people, although I do find some there. Go to Hollywood. Again, it's all about putting yourself first and getting your image out there and developing your brand. And so in some respects, humility, which the scriptures and Jesus talk about, is something that's sort of countercultural, isn't it?
Well, it really is. And I've said to couples for many years, there are a couple of verses in Philippians chapter 2 that I believe if couples would memorize those verses and start making that an active priority in their marriage, they would solve 90% of the marital problems that we're dealing with in most marriages. And the verses I have in mind are Philippians 2, verses 3 and 4, which say, do nothing from selfishness. And by the way, you can check me on this, Kerby, but if you look at the Greek word for nothing, it means nothing. Okay,
yes.
So do nothing from selfishness.
Yes.
Yeah. Or conceit, but with humility, regard one another as more important than yourself. If a husband and wife would both say, I'm going to regard you as more important than me, I think that would cure a lot of issues. Paul goes on to say, have this attitude in you that was also in Jesus. He's the model of humility. So don't look out for your own interests only, but look out for the interests of others. That's the heart of humility that says, I'm going to take a back seat and I'm going to put you in the front seat, and we're going to make your priorities what I'm going to focus on here.
Very good. One of the others, which kind of relates as well, each one of these connect to the other one. Chapter 5, it's my way or the love way. Love is generous. And again, love does not insist on its own way. Verse 5 in 1 Corinthians 13. It's also back to humility. It's also the willingness to be gracious. And most importantly, back to how you put it, to be generous.
Yeah, and I think this is a question when it says love does not insist on its own way. Coming out of a lack of humility will be this kind of insistence that my way is the right way. My way of thinking is the perfect way of thinking. My opinions are always the best, and you should align with where I'm coming from. And that's destructive for people, but that's destructive in a marriage relationship. I've learned over the years that Marianne's way of seeing things, Marianne's way of intuiting what's going on, I learn a ton from that. I will sometimes make quick decisions, and she will more carefully and more thoughtfully say, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And she adds a dimension to my thinking that would be lacking if all I was relying on was that things have to go my way. So this is where we tap into our humility and say, difference can be good in a marriage relationship. It can help expand the way I think about things, and I can be a better person if I will pause and listen and say, what am I missing here? Or what do you have to add to this conversation that might not be my initial impulse? And that's where I think we don't insist on our own way. We try to look for a collaborative way to get to where we need to get to in marriage.
And I was just thinking about that in chapter 8, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but love is honest, rejoices with the truth, because you have a quote there from Dennis Rainey. I've heard it before. If both of you thought alike, one of you would be unnecessary. So God has this ability of putting people together, and as a result, there are differences, and this is where, as you both seek to follow Jesus, husband and wife, it brings you closer together, and part of that is just being willing to listen and to to be honest, and this is just such a practical book. But I thought just before we run out of time, let's talk about how people can use it, because you have these sections called Talk Together. And so I think any couple could take this book, read a chapter, then take some of the Talk Together areas and begin to figure out how to put some shoe leather to some of the material that you've covered there in the Scriptures.
Well, that's what I was hoping. So in each chapter, there are about 3 or 4 different places where you stop the text and you just say, okay, here are a couple of questions for you to interact with together, in hopes that couples might, whether they're reading this book together or whether they're reading it on their own but want to start a dialogue, they might be able to start to explore what does this look like in our marriage. So it doesn't just become theoretical. It doesn't just change our thinking, but it starts to change our behavior. And of course, behavioral change needs to come out of the heart, out of our thinking being changed first. And so the Talk Together is really an attempt to get husbands and wives or engaged couples who might be going through this content to start to have some dialogue about what love looks like, with the goal of there being deeper, richer, more captivating, more hard-working love in a marriage relationship.
Let's, if we can, just before I let you go, talk about what is available at familylife.com. First of all, I highly recommend, when we come out of this lockdown, that people make their way, couples make their way to a weekend to remember. My wife and I have been to many of those. I have friends that teach at it. Of course, I know you do as well. And so that's the first thing that they may want to put on their schedule when that opens up. But as well, there is a podcast. Of course, there's the daily radio program. There are all sorts of books, lots of great information on marriage, parenting, even blended families, questions about faith, and so just some great resources. So when people land on the website, what will they find?
Well, you've outlined it. We try to provide practical biblical content, video, audio, text-based content, interactive content. There are some video courses you can take on marriage or on parenting. You can subscribe to the Family Life Today podcast and listen to that on your devices, or find it on your local radio station. We're all about helping to effectively develop godly marriages and families. And I think every marriage I know can use a little booster shot regularly to remind you of what your priorities need to be in your marriage and in your family. And that's what we try to provide at familylife.com.
Again, I highly recommend that. See what you can find there in terms of the resources, the archives, the podcast. And then, of course, when it opens up, I would encourage you to go to a weekend to remember. Bob Lepine, such a great friend. We've known you for decades and certainly appreciate you being on with us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for the invitation, Kerby. Always great to be with you.
This book just came out. That's why I wanted to give you a quick interview right now. We may come back and do one even in more detail, but most of you probably did not know the book came out, and it just came out a week ago, and that's why we scheduled this time with Bob Lepine. Let him get back to all the busyness that he is involved with. And when we come back, I'm going to look at a couple of issues in the news, one of which has become controversial, and that is I want to try to give you the best evidence we can look at in terms of, is it time to reopen the schools? And I'd love to get your thoughts. Maybe you think it is maybe dangerous to do so. Maybe you think there's some value in it. And if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
The year 2020 has been filled with problems, or let's just call them challenges. Before I get into that, we want to thank you. We just passed the end of our fiscal year, and many stepped up in a very big and sacrificial way, showing just how much they believe that Point of View is needed as we head into the last half of this year. And that's where our new challenge comes in. At the last minute, a friend stepped up with a surprising $50,000 matching challenge, and listeners matched it. But after that, yet another friend, knowing how important this year is, put down another $50,000 challenge, and because we were so close to deadline, said we could extend it just a bit to July 15th. As our nation deals with so many issues, make sure that Point of View can be a strong voice for truth by helping us complete that second match. Double your investment by giving at pointofview.net/time or call 1-800-347 5151. The clock is ticking. Pointofview.net/time. That's TIME, pointofview.net/time, or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Want to come back to this idea of reopening the schools. And again, this is a controversial issue, so I'm trying to give you all the points here. And when we talk about this, the first article actually makes a case for reopening the schools. And as everything else has become politicized, when the president and the secretary of education say we really need to move to open the schools, all of a sudden he's being irresponsible. This is dangerous. This is not scientific. Again, the American Academy of Pediatrics has warned since the beginning of this summer that if we don't open the schools, in a sense, we are, by keeping kids at home, we're going to face far greater health risks than even the coronavirus. And my commentary today really relates more to adults, maybe teenagers, talks about deadly isolation, in which indeed we talk about the remarkable increase in the number of drug overdose deaths because of some of the lockdowns and those kinds of issues. And I am mindful of some of the dangers. We are broadcasting today from a county, Dallas County, where yesterday they had 1,100 new coronavirus cases. This is the 11th straight day that the count has exceeded 1,000 a day. And so the county judge said something that I've been saying for some time, and that is people are more likely to come into contact with someone who has the virus now than when we actually issued those stay-at-home orders. So I'm not minimizing any of that, but at the same time, I want to get your thoughts about this and put some facts on the table and a couple of articles. We've been talking about marriage. We'll also talk about schools. So let's take to a phone call or two. James in Arizona. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Brother Kerby, how are you?
Very good. Thanks for joining us.
I have a late statement on the marriage. One thing that I learned, and unfortunately I learned the hard way, is that you have to deal with your baggage going into marriage first. It doesn't matter if you've been married before or never married. There's all sorts of things out there like abuses,
sure,
or wrong thinking, or addictions. And when you go into a marriage, it compounds because what you've done is you've pulled somebody else into your world. Now, my wife and I, by the grace of our Lord, we have worked through that, but others have not. That was my statement.
And it's a good point. I've said that sometimes people go to divorce courts because they failed to work out through other things that maybe you and your wife did. And even if you came from a pretty nice family background, and you don't have abuse and addiction and things like that in your background, and most of us have something like that, but even if you came from something that was pretty positive, you still end up marrying somebody that's different. Maybe you grew up in a household where everything's out on the table and we argue and we debate, and the other is, no, you just stuff it and keep it all inside, and then all of a sudden the communication is kind of stifled. So you are bringing together two individuals from two different families with two different sets of assumptions, and that's why I highly recommend any of these marriage books, any of these marriage seminars, a weekend to remember at certainly the great work that is being done by Family Life Today. So that is very much the case. I think you also want to talk about opening the schools. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, opening the schools, I think that's the individual parents that need to decide that, not the state. After all, this is, let's say my son or our son or our daughters are still going to school. There are son or daughters, and we have to weigh whether we're going to send them or not. There has been an increase in children contracting the COVID.
Yeah.
So I believe until we get all the facts and truthful facts, not clickbait facts, we cannot make a decision.
Very good. And again, I would say that if there's ever been a case for individual decisions, individual school districts, and even in terms of age, because that's what I want to get into in just a minute. This article that I've posted here, which is our first article, says, the evidence, scientific, health, and economic argues overwhelmingly for schools to open in the fall. He says start with the relative immunity of young children to the disease, and that should reassure parents because according, as he says, to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 30 children under the age of 15 have died of COVID-19, but in a typical year, 190 children die of the flu, 436 from suicide, 625 from homicide, 4,114 from unintentional deaths such as drowning. And if you just pick out one area where we broadcast, Chicago, only 2 children under the age of 18 have died in Chicago, which is actually fewer than the number that were killed in the shootings last weekend. So what are we finding out? The younger you are, the safer you are. And yesterday I talked a little bit about some of the research that has come out of Australia, the Netherlands, and a couple of others. Here's an interesting one that is in this article, that a retrospective study of schools in northern France from February before the lockdowns found that despite the situation in which we had 3 introductions of the virus into 3 primary schools, there appears to be no further transmission of the virus to other pupils or teachers. Now, can we do this safely? Yesterday, I talked about some of the arguments. Here's some from the Trump administration, which were similar to ones that were recommended yesterday. For example, spacing desks 6 feet apart, staggering class periods so that they aren't excusing at the same time, like in an elementary school. Make kids wear face coverings when possible. Keep them in the same cohort, because this is one of the things that, especially by the time you get to middle school, you move the kids from one class to the next. Would be probably better to move the teachers from one class to the next. Now, of course, you have to move them to classrooms where, let's say it's a science classroom. Of course, you're going to need where you have beakers or microscopes, or an art classroom or something like that. Have them eat, play, and learn outdoors as much as possible. Teachers wear face shields. There are all sorts of things that are being proposed. But you know as well as I do that as soon as even one kid gets sick, the fear of lawsuits or the fear of any kind of reprisal is going to be there. But as this particular article points out, keeping schools closed while awaiting a vaccine is not an acceptable alternative. If you've heard me talk about when a vaccine might be available, we've only had 2 now going into the next clinical trial. And as he says, I love this line, you don't need a degree in child psychology to know that kids have struggled with virtual education. And there is another issue to think about. He closes his article by saying millions of parents can't return to work if their children can't attend school. Opening the schools is essential to the well-being of the students, teachers, and administrators who have the duty to make it happen. So this is, of course, going to be continually controversial. I will try as best as possible to bring some of the evidence here. But again, let me quote from the American Academy of Pediatrics, which urged school systems to reopen school at the start of the upcoming academic year in the fall. That could be August or September, arguing that keeping children at home poses a far greater health risk than the coronavirus. Children, they say, are much less likely to become infected with COVID-19, and if they do, they're much less likely to become symptomatic and spread the virus. Again, the American Academy of Pediatrics strongly advocates that all policy considerations for the coming school year should start with the goal of having students physically present in school. The importance of in-person learning is well documented, and there's already evidence of negative impacts on children because of school closures in the spring of 2020. So, of course, in the midst of this, you've had a pushback from the teachers, and let's just have the second article I've posted here. The Los Angeles teachers, the United Teachers of Los Angeles Union, called for, this is what you have to do before they'll open the schools, called for the defunding of police, a moratorium on new charter schools, which we talked about yesterday, new wealth taxes on California's millionaires and billionaires, and Medicare for all at the federal level, in a paper that was issued just the other day. Matter of fact, it also called for $500 billion. That's $500 billion, if you can't get that in your head. $500 billion in additional federal assistance to K through 12 schools, in addition to passing Medicare for all. Otherwise, the United Teachers of Los Angeles said, we're not going to open schools. So this is getting to be much more politicized than you would have imagined. And if you think that I'm making that up, that is why I posted that as the second article. It is, when I first read it, I said, of course this has got to be a joke. It's got to be Babylon Bee. It's got to be The Onion. It's got to be, well, no, apparently not. That's what is happening there. And the argument is that the call by the president and the Secretary of Education is anti-science. And yet notice what the American Academy of Pediatrics is saying. Anyway, just want to put that on the table for your consideration. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me just mention next hour as a program note that Pastor Mark Vroegop will be with us, and he is the pastor of College Park Church in Indianapolis, and we'll be talking about this issue of racial reconciliation. The book, Weep With Me, How Lament Opens the Door for Racial Reconciliation. I think it'll be a great conversation with Mark Vroegop. And just before we take time to focus on that, let me pick up a story that I mentioned yesterday. And that is, you may remember when I talked about the fact that the CEO of Robert Unanue, who is the head of Goya Foods, and any of you that have a Hispanic background or like a Mexican or Tex-Mex, you got to love it. Anyway, he was at the White House speaking in the Rose Garden and just talked about how we were blessed to have a leader like President Trump. And immediately all the cancel culture just came out and said, well, then we're just going to boycott his food. And I love this article by Douglas Golden, who said, I knew as soon as he said that, the knives would come out for him. And he says, hey, if you feel good canceling a corporation founded by a Spanish immigrant in 1936 because the company's CEO was willing to appear at the White House, go for it. But there's plenty of other people on the other side. Now, first of all, he did point out, the CEO, that he had also appeared in a similar event with Barack Obama and Michelle Obama. Oh, no controversy there. Could you even imagine if a conservative called for a boycott of his food because in that case he said something positive about Barack Obama? Well, you can't even imagine that. But of course, you know exactly what came out. And I'll just read a few of these. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talked about making your own food. Lin-Manuel Miranda, remember him from Hamilton. We learned to bake our bread in this pandemic. We can learn to make some of the other Mexican ideas. And of course, Julian Castro said that Goya Foods has been a staple of so many Latino households for generations. Now the CEO praising the president. Well, we can't have that, of course. So there are all sorts of people out there on Twitter saying, well, we need to boycott Goya Foods. But there have been a lot of others that said, okay, we'll do a boycott. That happened before. Remember when they were wanting to boycott Chick-fil-A and all of you joined up and said, well, then we'll just go buy Chick-fil-A. And we had reports on this program of lines stretching out into the highway and people being willing to sit in line for hours to go and spend money at whether it was Chick-fil-A or sometimes we encourage people to do that to Hobby Lobby or whatever. Mark Levin said, go out today and buy your Goya Foods. Mark Opaleka, I think is how you say his name. My brother came up with a terrific idea, and I'm encouraging all of us to join me in purchasing $10 worth of Goya Foods products and donating them to our local food bank. Let's push a boycott, not a boycott. Let's show them what people of compassion can do. And I think it's a good idea, by the way, even if you don't like frijoles blanco or anything else that you can get, all sorts of great stuff. Well, and I do, by the way. But if you don't, you could still donate those to your food bank. Abby Johnson's been on the program here. She said, time to stock my pantry with Goya Foods. Tammy Bruce, columnist, I've never tried Goya Foods before. It will now be my first brand to go to. I appreciate the recipes on their site. Pretty good. Laura Ingram said, fight the cancel culture. I'm buying every can of Goya food I can find this weekend. The CEO praises Trump at a White House and backlash is swift. And Senator Marco Rubio, I'm just giving you a few of the tweets that have surfaced. Most of these people fronting about a Goya boycott either don't use Goya Foods anyways, and most of the ones who don't want to cave in anyway, so that's kind of good. Anyway, that has been the phenomenon. I'll let you decide whether you want to go out and do a boycott or a boycott. I think, again, whatever you think of the president, whatever you might even think of this CEO for saying a nice thing about the president, I am so fed up with the cancel culture. I think that's reason enough to go and counter-program to whatever they're saying. Every time they try to cancel somebody, I'm ready to go out and buy that, whatever it is, DVD, that product, or whatever it might be. So I'll let you make those decisions, but we just can't continue to allow the cancel culture, this liberal progressive mindset, to just dominate. And there is a sleeping giant out there, many of whom are in this audience right now. And if you go out and take some deliberate steps, that would be really positive. Let me also mention that my viewpoint commentary today kind of relates back to the issue of the schools. It's entitled Deadly Isolation. And I point out in this particular case that the lockdowns during the pandemic may have helped our physical or medical health, but it didn't help our mental health. We are seeing a dramatic increase in the drug overdose deaths. And the database that was constructed by the Washington Post found a troubling correlation between these lockdowns and drug overdose deaths. Now, again, I recognize a correlation doesn't mean causation, but I think you can logically infer that. And the writers there even point out that if you assume that drug use has remained constant during the lockdown, which I doubt, but okay, let's just assume that for a minute. Still, why are the drug overdoses increasing? Well, they say, first of all, the pandemic and the lockdowns have disrupted all sorts of supply chains, including the drug supply chains. And so this might have led more and more people to use deadly synthetic drugs. The second reason is even more dark and disturbing. In a world of isolation and social distancing, many of these sequestered people were taking drugs alone, which means there maybe was no one there if they had an overdose to call 911. So, and frankly, I do believe that there's probably pretty good evidence that drug overdoses increased because drug use increased. People were home alone, had little to do. Jobs were providing structure and purpose. Now they're not getting drug tested, so they could actually use drugs. Provided them with earned income. Provided them with self-esteem. Now they've lost their income. They've lost their self-esteem. They've lost their jobs. And so if nothing else, it's just, again, a reminder that sometimes this isolation is really deadly and is something that needs to be addressed. And certainly opening the schools are one part, and just recognizing that as sad as it is for some of these infections to be increasing, there is a cost on the other side that sometimes was up until now fairly invisible. And so if you go to the website, pointofview.net, click on the viewpoint section there, you can get the commentary. Also, I appreciate the fact that Karen put up a graph to just show you the overwhelming increase in drug overdose deaths that you can see compared to last year. So you can see some of that on the website. And if you're not signed up to receive my daily Viewpoints commentary, it's free. Would love to send it to your inbox, and so click on that button there as well. Speaking of buttons, we do have one that says 100,000 matching fund, and you know the story by now. We certainly tried to end one of the matches as it was supposed to end on our end of fiscal year, which is June 30th, but the other individual said he would extend it to July 15th, which is tomorrow. By the way, your tax is due tomorrow if you haven't turned them in. I've turned in mine. And some of you want to know how we're doing. We're down to the last 1,000 or so. So you, with your gift, will put us over the top. So if you've been thinking about giving and you want to be the one to put us over the top, reach our $100,000 matching fund, your gift right now, even as we go to a break, probably will do that. And we want to say thank you at a time when I know some of you listening have lost your jobs. It means the world that others of you were willing to step up and help us meet that matching fund. I'm assuming we'll meet it, but again, I know enough to know that lots of times people wait to the very last day, the very last hour, and we do have one more day tomorrow, but I suspect given the generosity of this audience, we'll probably go over pretty quickly here. And so if you've been waiting to push us over the top, now's the time to do so. Come back, we're going to be talking with Mark Vroegop about this idea of lament and how that could maybe open the door for racial reconciliation. Another topic that we wanted to put on the table, and that's what we will be talking about right after these important messages.
The year 2020 has been filled with problems, or let's just call them challenges. Before I get into that, we want to thank you. We just passed the end of our fiscal year, and many stepped up in a very big and sacrificial way, showing just how much they believe that Point of View is needed as we head into the last half of this year. And that's where our new challenge comes in. At the last minute, a friend stepped up with a surprising $50,000 matching challenge, and listeners matched it. But after that, yet another friend, knowing how important this year is, put down another $50,000 challenge, and because we were so close to deadline, said we could extend it just a bit to July 15th. As our nation deals with so many issues, make sure that Point of View can be a strong voice for truth by helping us complete that second match. Double your investment by giving at pointofview.net/time or call 1-800-347-5151. The clock is ticking. Pointofview.net/time. That's TIME. Pointofview.net/time or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about racial reconciliation. We talked about that yesterday in the first hour. Today, we want to look at it in a different way and to look at it in terms of lament. And there is a very good book that won the ECPA Christian Book of the Year called Dark Clouds, Dark Mercy, Discovering the Grace of Lament, which is written by our author, which precedes this book, which is entitled Weep With Me, How Lament Opens a Door for Racial Reconciliation. And it is written by Pastor Mark Vroegop, who is the lead pastor at College Park Church in Indianapolis and joins us now by phone. So, Pastor, thank you for joining us today on Point of View.
Kerby, it's a pleasure for me to be with you today. Thanks for having me on your program.
Let's talk about the earlier book, because in some respects it set the stage for this one, and that is your earlier book, of course, talks about if really maybe the nuances of lament that you find not just in Lamentations by Jeremiah, but also in the Psalms, and really helps us understand the significance of lament, which is quite frankly, something you don't hear a great deal about in Christian churches. So if nothing else, kudos for you for focusing on a very necessary part of the whole counsel of God that you brought together in the first book. But you also, in some respects, apply a lot of it in this book called Weep With Me.
Yeah, lament is something that has become a bit of a passion of mine, although most of us, when we find lament, it's really found us. Not many people study lament on purpose. It usually happens because they come into a personal crisis, and then they find this language that can really serve to validate their pain and also give them a path how to walk through difficult times. And so it's a really important language. I've been pleased to see how the Lord seems to be recovering it in some respects in the church. And boy, I also hope that we can learn how to apply it as it relates to racial reconciliation.
Also appreciate the fact that not only do a number of people who endorse this book who have been on this program, but you also had some that are actually feature their prayers of lament, and that's kind of a who's who of some of the people that we've had on this program as well. So it really breaks down into three sections, and I want to give it a due course through this: the lament in the Bible and in history, then the lament and majority Christians, and then lament and minority Christians. But I guess even as we were talking yesterday with Dr. Jim Dennison, probably need some definitions, and you talk about that early on, because what do we mean by racism? What do we mean by lament? Those are a couple of things that we probably need to get out of the way fairly quickly if we're going to understand kind of how you want to apply some of these principles.
Yeah. Precision in language is always important, isn't it? But it's especially important when dealing with things like racial reconciliation, because it's so loaded and we can kind of start from a wrong perspective. So let's just start with the definition of lament. I define it in both Weep With Me and Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy as a prayer in pain that leads to trust. So it's the kind of Song of Sorrow language featured in a third of the Psalms. So 1 out of every 3 Psalms. Book of Lamentations features this sacred song of pain and difficulty, and then it's all throughout the Bible and other places as well. And so lament is the way that believers have historically talked to God when they're facing pain, grief, or injustice. Sometimes it's done together, sometimes it's done collectively, but it's the way that believers historically have talked to God when they're in a hard place. As we think about racism, there is only one human race. There's varying ethnicities, but racism as a category was something that's a part of the American history, part of our story as a nation, where the classification of people based upon the color of their skin, people were grouped into broad categories of white and black, particularly in the 1920s, and then from there. And racism is basically the identification of that social construct that then also adds a level of supremacy in it, one group viewing the other as less than the other. And that's where racism comes from. So it's an ism in the fact that it's a system of thought, and it's projected on a class of people. And in the case of the United States, obviously, it's been historically applied to African Americans or black people.
Well, and again, early on, you talk about coming from a Dutch heritage, but then talking to someone else in a pastor's office who said, look, your grandfather was able to get a job in the 1940s. The color of his skin didn't create any barriers. Do you think my black grandfather could have been hired for the same job as your white grandfather in the 1940s? So we recognize that we have certainly had everything from segregation, racism, Jim Crow, going even further back, slavery, and those kinds of things. So in some respects, now help us understand how we should start thinking about applying some of the, if you will, what you call the basics of lament. This is kind of new territory because even though it's in the scriptures, like you said, a third of the Psalms, all of the book of Lamentations, how about even Romans 12, weep with those who weep, which I assume has a lot to do with, of course, the title of your book. Nevertheless, it's kind of new territory. So give us a little bit of guidance here on how that would begin to be applied.
Yeah, as it relates to the racial reconciliation conversation, part of the problem is that often because of our cultural divisions, because of our inexperience in dialoguing about this, we come to a particular issue and it's almost as if we don't speak the same language. As a result, there's miscommunication, there's misunderstanding, and then immediately what we tend to do, which is what human beings have just done historically, is we retreat to our ideological corners and create defensive positions. And what we need to recognize is, particularly as it relates to the white-black divide, that our black brothers and sisters are grieving. And that grief has been a part of the American experience. And when a black brother or sister is sharing about how they even view like the killing of George Floyd, we need to let our first step as Christians be one of empathy and applying the Romans 12 concept of weeping with those who weep. And so what I want to do is to insert lament in kind of a racial reconciliation process that I identified as love. I'm going to commit that I'm going to love you as a brother or sister in Christ. Listen, I'm going to apply James 1:19 and be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to get irritated, and then lament, which is actually the first action step that we can take, having really listened. And then if you lament well, you're able to really learn and then to leverage. And so love, listen, lament, learn, and leverage is kind of that process. And I think what lament does is it gives us something to do, a way to empathize and a way to enter into someone's pain so that we can move forward towards reconciliation.
Let's take a break, but if you have something to write with, again, those L words, fivefold, very important: love, listen, lament, learn, and leverage. Love, listen, lament, learn, and leverage. Of course, it's one of the reasons you might want to get a copy of the book. It's published by Crossway, and of course, we have information about it on our website because we thought that you would be interested in seeing how this might apply. And again, we have information about it on the website. It is just now coming out. Actually, its publication date is today, and so you might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we've made it easy for you to order it in paperback or Kindle. And we'll continue our conversation about this book, Weep With Me, right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The lockdowns during the pandemic may have been helpful for our physical health, but they have not been so helpful for our mental health. One example can be seen in the dramatic increase in drug overdose deaths. The database constructed by the Washington Post found a troubling correlation between the lockdowns and drug overdose deaths. Of course, a correlation doesn't mean causation, but I think we can reasonably infer the connection between the two. Even if you assume that drug use during the lockdowns has remained constant, the writers at the newspaper still come up with two reasons why drug overdose deaths have increased. First, the pandemic and lockdowns have disrupted the drug supply chains. This might have led to more and more drug users to taking more deadly synthetic drugs. Now, the second reason is even darker and more disturbing. You know, in a world of isolation and social distancing, many of these sequestered people are taking drugs alone. That means it is less likely that there might be someone else around who could call 911. So drug use in the midst of social isolation has become deadly. Of course, there's really every reason to believe that drug use did increase during the lockdowns. People were home alone with little to do. Their jobs used to provide structure and purpose. It also provided them with earned income and self-esteem. Many of the people at home lost their jobs, and so it's easy to see why more isolated people might turn to drugs. So when we look at this, increased drug use and increased drug overdose deaths are an important factor to keep in mind when politicians call for another lockdown. There are a number of mental and medical costs associated with lockdowns that are often ignored in the political debates and discussions. There is indeed a deadly cost to social isolation. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Pastor Mark Vroegop, and his book is entitled Weep With Me, How Lament Opens a Door for Racial Reconciliation, and it is just out today. It is published by our good friends at Crossway, and if you have any difficulty finding it, of course, we have a link there so you can get it in paperback or Kindle. And Mark, for just a minute, let's talk about how the book is put together, because each one of the sections has a lament prayer. Then there's a series of discussion questions, and we just a minute ago talked about those steps of reconciliation: love, listen, lament, learn, and leverage. So the way you have this put together, it certainly could be something that an individual could read through. But I also know we have lots of listeners that are Bible study teachers, Bible fellowship teachers, small group teachers. The way this is put together, this really could be an ongoing kind of dynamic discussion. So give us an idea of how you think this book could be used by some of our listeners.
Well, you've identified at least two. One would be just individuals who are trying to increase their competency in this conversation. And I just encourage people to regularly be reading in this space, because there are so many layers, so many nuances, so many challenges. When something is this hot and this controversial, I think it's important to understand kind of the landscape, lest you kind of wander into a land and don't have a map. And so I hope my book will be one of many that people will read individually. But I really hope they won't stop there, because where the real learning and growth comes is when you're able to discuss it in the context of a community, especially a community of people who don't look like you, who come from different backgrounds and ethnicities, people whose experiences have been not like yours. And that's where the real beautiful convergence of both biblical truth and life experience can happen. I'd also love to see it in the context of Sunday school classes or small groups. I tried to write it in a way that it's both winsome, biblical, tried to have the right tone so that people would feel free to dialogue with one another about this, so that, again, they could just maybe find a language that helps to give them a path forward as they're stumbling their way through this really challenging conversation.
Well, since we're going to let you be our guide through some unfamiliar territory, one of those is lessons from African American spirituals. I would imagine that a fraction of a percent of all of our listeners would know much about that particular area. So what can we learn from the whole issue of African American spirituals?
You know, it just creates an opportunity for us to pause and listen and to realize the experience of our Black brothers and sisters, both nationally and historically, have been in a hard place. And that's what really created the spirituals. The notion of what do I do with this pent up pain and this challenge of something that feels like I can't get out of it. Well, the African American spirituals help us to really hear about that experience. And, you know, prayer and music in particular have a way of getting into certain parts of our hearts that just objective truth can't all by itself. It's one of the reasons why we love the Psalms, is because we go there. It combines a poetic meter, heartfelt language, and the Psalms are kind of our go-to place when we're hurting. In the same way, you really learn about the pains and the difficulties of what African Americans went through in the United States by taking a look at those spirituals. It also allows us to honor that tradition. And part of the burden that I think is upon the church at present, particularly the white evangelical church, is to be sure that we're really listening and really honoring the history of our Black brothers and sisters, because often that history has been either marginalized or ignored. So I think it's a great moment for us just to say, let's just sit and listen and allow our hearts to be instructed by these spirituals.
You do talk about 4 ways in which the spirituals help us: a broader view of history, humble, respectful listening. Of course, that's, again, James 1:19. Honoring the depth of sorrow, and personalizing lament. So it seems to me that is some of the benefit of actually being able to dig into some of those areas, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, for sure. Spirituals allow us to take a step and to realize, now, what would this actually sound like? So for many of us, lament is an unfamiliar language. And one of the reasons that I asked various leaders to contribute lament prayers is I wanted people to hear what it would sound like personified with particular people, given their own life experience. And then also, as the readers kind of walk through, some of those lament prayers are more pointed than others, and it allows us to even begin to put into practice right away. Am I really willing to listen? Am I really willing to embrace what this brother or sister is saying in their grief? Or do I immediately want to kind of go to the place that so often we go to, and I immediately want to argue with them about why did you choose that word? And the fact of the matter is lament is a helpful language. It just kind of causes everyone to settle down and say, let's just start by talking to the Lord about this and listening to each other.
Again, might just also mention that perhaps one of those very significant times in which lament and even Negro spirituals or Black spirituals or African American spirituals have been called different things, probably the most famous reference was in Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, in which he talks about what he, again, I'm using his phrase, the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last. And so in some respects, there was a connection to those, what we today call African American spirituals, even during the Civil Rights Movement. And that brings me to the next chapter, because you talk about the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I'm old enough to remember when that happened, and I was alive. I know a lot of our listeners were younger. But you tell a story that I actually had never heard, and that is, as soon as, of course, we all heard about the assassination, you know, what happened around the world and around the country was amazing, but not in Indianapolis. And since you're a pastor there, I guess you knew more about it than the rest of us, in which you had a speech given by, at this time, Robert Kennedy. He was involved, of course, in his campaign. Interestingly enough, he was the one who, in this speech, actually announced it to the audience. You can hear, if you listen to the audio, the gasp, but then, shows empathy by saying, I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand and go beyond these rather difficult times. And while many of the other cities were burning, that speech provides, as you talk about here, kind of this bridge of lament. Explain, if you might.
Yeah, there's this park in Indianapolis that I discovered a couple of years ago, landmark for Memorial Peace Park. It's where that speech was actually given. And so we've taken our staff there on various moments, kind of a short little pilgrimage and things of that sort. And, right there in the park is the speech that Kennedy gave. And it's just an amazing moment to consider the kind of empathy that he was able to engage with that crowd. And, historians would tell you that speech was very likely instrumental in helping to keep the peace in Indianapolis. There are probably other things that were involved as well. But you can actually listen to the speech online, and it's a remarkable moment just to hear both that announcement, to hear Kennedy's empathy. And it's also a really good example of how people who know and understand pain are able to speak the language of other people in pain. And one of the reasons I've written the book is to try and help people know that's lament. And if you can learn it, you'll not only be able to apply it in your life when you're in pain, but you also begin to hear other people's pain differently. In fact, that's part of what happened for me. That the story of our life with our loss of our daughter cued me into this language, and I began to hear it. And then as I began to have more and more relationships with Black brothers and sisters, I began to see actually what they're going through is lament. It's not the same thing, but it's applied in a unique way. And it helped me to be able to navigate this conversation, as challenging and as difficult as it is at times.
The book is entitled Weep With Me, How Lament Opens a Door for Racial Reconciliation. When we come back, we'll look at two sections, Lament and Majority Christians, and then Lament and Minority Christians. And so we hope that this will be taking some of these ideas and helping you apply them as we talk about empathy and grace and remorse and redeeming the pain and all sorts of other aspects that we will get into. The book is just out. So again, you may not find it in your bookstore in the next couple of days, but it should arrive. But if not, we've made it very easy for you to order it online in both paperback and Kindle, and it would be a great resource to take not only your family through or even your Sunday school group too, but a larger community through as well. So again, just wanted to focus on this issue of racial reconciliation, and we have again all sorts of information about it on our website, and so I hope that you'll go there. Don't forget, we still have the matching fund. You'll probably be able to put us over the top, so anything you can do to help us out, it's all available at the website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
The year 2020 has been filled with problems, or let's just call them challenges. Before I get into that, we want to thank you. We just passed the end of our fiscal year, and many stepped up in a very big and sacrificial way, showing just how much they believe that Point of View is needed as we head into the last half of this year. And that's where our new challenge comes in. At the last minute, a friend stepped up with a surprising $50,000 matching challenge, and listeners matched it. But after that, yet another friend, knowing how important this year is, put down another $50,000 challenge, and because we were so close to deadline, said we could extend it just a bit to July 15th. As our nation deals with so many issues, make sure that Point of View can be a strong voice for truth by helping us complete that second match. Double your investment by giving at pointofview.net/time or call 1-800-347-5151. The clock is ticking. Pointofview.net/time. That's TIME. Pointofview.net/time or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Mark Vroegop. And again, if you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Weep with me. And Pastor Mark Vroegop is the pastor and the author, not only of this book, but I might mention the one before, Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, Discovering the Grace of Lament, which was Christian Book of the Year for ECPA. And this new one, of course, Weep with Me, How Lament Opens the Door for Racial Reconciliation. I thought, Mark, we'd talk about two sections of the book, Lament and Majority Christians first, and that brings us into Weep, Speak, and Repent. First of all, weep, it's this idea of the healing grace of empathy. And you've been talking about this idea of empathy, but what's the connection there between empathy and lament and grace? How does that all fit together?
Well, empathy is the language of grace when you're dealing with somebody who's hurting. It needs to be the first step to even have a conversation. For example, just in my own marriage, I know this to be true. When my wife is hurting and I come home from work and she's troubled about something, I mean, the first thing I need to do is to sit and listen and enter into her pain. And even if I think I know what the solution is, or even if I have questions for her, I won't be very helpful if I don't start by empathizing and helping her as somebody who's grieving. And I think what's true in marriage is also true as it relates to racial reconciliation. The problem is I find that many Christians who look like me just miss the fact that Black brothers and sisters are deeply grieving. And I think as a result, we need to approach them with an empathetic posture instead of an argumentative posture. And if we could just get that piece first, again, James 1:19, be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to get angry, and that could be super, super helpful. If we don't, we end up, again, retreating to our corners, and the conversation just spirals downward from there. So I think empathy is the key that unlocks the door, and lament is the biblical language of empathy.
You know, when we talk about slow to speak, that brings to the next chapter because, of course, we've had people with signs saying silence is painful, silence is racism, and a number of other things. But there are, within your chapter there, 6 reasons why we choose silence. And sometimes, of course, it's fear, it's uncertainty. We don't want to pull out more wounds. Maybe it's ignorance, could be selfishness, or a number of others. But it could be, especially since you and I a couple of times now have mentioned John 1 or James 1:19, to think, well, then I guess the best issue is I'll just always listen. I won't say anything. But that's why you have that chapter in the book, isn't it?
It is. And I want to be clear. I think there is a time to not speak. You know, words need to be chosen carefully. The problem, though, with the topic of race in America and race in the context of the church is the deafening silence of the white church as it relates to this issue. And so, I don't agree with the notion of, silence is violence and things of that sort, where in every situation your silence, is destructive. But I would say that I think in general that the problem within white evangelicalism has not been that we've said too much on this, but it's that we've retreated and not spoken out when we needed to. So I talk about, the letter from the Birmingham jail where Martin Luther King Jr. identifies this as a problem. And what's more, I identify that the challenge is that our Black brothers and sisters they don't know why we're silent. And I think that silence then can send the wrong message and it can be unhelpful. And so I just try and encourage believers to say, hey, I think there's a place to be able to speak into this that goes beyond virtue signaling. And I think lament is an appropriate way to express solidarity and also to say, I'm with you in the midst of this pain, even though I don't know all of its contours.
And one of the things I might suggest, and you can agree or disagree with me on this, is that sometimes people don't know what to say, but let me just mention a few people that have endorsed your book. Crawford Loritz, I've done various teaching and preaching with him over the years. Another person that endorses your book is Russell Moore. Yesterday, of course, we had Dr. Jim Dennison on. On a regular basis, we have Dr. Tony Evans. Some people might say, well, I don't know what to say, Okay, you don't necessarily have to be a wordsmith. Maybe what you say are to repeat or to agree with things that have been said by more articulate voices in the evangelical community. What's your thoughts about that?
Well, yeah, for sure. And that's where I think you could model your words based upon the example of others who are maybe a little bit ahead of you in this regard. But, it's the same thing is true with grief. Like, one of the reasons I wrote my first book was because I just found that Christians didn't know what to say to grieving people. Grief is scary at every level. And when you add the race component to it, man, it's doubly scary. And I think there could be a place for a believer to say, look, I don't know what to say, but can I at least just lament with you over the fact that I know that this hurts you and I don't know what to say, so let's pray together. And that could actually be a good start. And that's why those lament prayers are in that book, is to try and help people know what might this sound like, so that they could not only learn, but also they could then use that to apply it in relationships within their sphere of influence.
Yes, and again, the lament prayer there on the One on Speak is from Danny Aiken's been on the program with us, president of the Southeastern Baptist Seminary, which also is a great lead-in to the next one. We've talked about weep, speak, repent. And I appreciate the fact that you start that chapter with the resolution on racial reconciliation that was passed by the Southern Baptist Convention many years ago. And it does seem to me that that is one way to go. But also you talk about the civil rights vision trip a couple times in the chapters. Talk about that as well, because I think that would be another action item for people to consider.
One of the ways we have wanted to try and shape the hearts and minds of our people is to help them not just know this intellectually, not just know this relationally, but to know this experientially. And again, that's why the spirituals are helpful. It's why lament as a language is helpful. It takes realities and it brings it into experience. So instead of just orthodoxy, that we've got an understanding of what it means to feel the right things. And so we took 50 leaders over the last 2 years on a 5 to 6 day vision trip where we toured cities like Birmingham and Montgomery and Selma and Memphis, and we used lament as a way to engage with one another and talk to the Lord as we visited these various sites. And lament became the language of how we were processing what we were experiencing in these historical locations. And so it allows for people to wrestle with the past of the history of the United States, realizing that nearly everyone on that bus was not alive during that era. But it allows them to make the bridge between, look, you can't repent for what your ancestors did, but you can express remorse and repudiate and say, that's not who I want to be anymore. And making that connection, I think, is really helpful and redemptive, and lament is part of the way that bridge can be built.
I might just mention that one of the appendices in your book is a sample civil rights vision trip itinerary where you go to Birmingham, Alabama, Montgomery, and Selma, Alabama, as well as places like Greenwood and Memphis, and just give people an idea of how to do that. You've also got the Psalms of Lament appendices, as well as another one on learning to lament worksheet. So this kind of summarizes the whole idea of how to apply this to majority Christians. But let's now, if we can, talk about lament and minority Christians. One of those is protest, the voice of exiles. What do we need to learn there?
Yeah, and this is where, to be very just transparent, I am a little bit uncomfortable, and I mentioned that in the book.
Sure.
To be able to speak to minority Christians whose pain I see, but I don't fully understand, is challenging. As a pastor, I'm still required and need to be able to do so. Lament is the kind of language that allows hurting people to say to God, this isn't right. And that extends from just the personal grief of what we're experiencing, looking at a world that's controlled by the sovereignty of God and seeing the sinfulness that is still here and saying, Lord Jesus, come quickly. But it also allows for a black brother and sister, when they face the kind of looming clouds of otherness, when they feel distance because of their ethnicity, and whether that's real or perceived, it feels real. And lament is a language for them to talk to God about that, and a place to go with their pain, to say, this is part of the brokenness of the world. And my hope was that this section would actually keep some Black brothers engaged in the conversation when, in the intensity of the moment, it's understandable,
yes.
but there's some who would say, look, I just can't do this anymore. And I understand that.
Sure.
I'm just trying to see, is there a language that maybe could help white Christians understand more and Black Christians continue to stay in the conversation when they've been in it so long?
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about this a little bit more. Let me open up the phones, too. Maybe you've said, I've never heard of someone using this idea of lament to issue and to address the issue of racial reconciliation. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take a phone call or two if you would like. If not, you want to just sit back. We have a lot more to cover, and it's all part of the book, Weep With Me, a book that just came out, published by Crossway. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we talk about the book Weep With Me. Mark Vroegop is with us, and again we are talking about a resource that I think is going to be very helpful to you. We've been talking about lament in the Bible and history, lament and majority Christians, now kind of in an area of a little more controversy, lament and minority Christians, difficult for individuals that have never actually dealt with this issue of discrimination to address it. But again, I appreciate your willingness to talk about, as we did just a minute ago, protest. But let's get to the last two, triumph and believe. First of all, triumph is the idea of redeeming the pain. There are various layers of pain that you talk about, but even how to lament, to turn, to complain, to ask and to trust. It's kind of a 4-step process, but that's something that even you actually tried to implement in these civil rights vision trips, isn't it?
It is, and it proved to be transformative. As we were traveling along on a bus, we would spend the morning in devotions together. We'd study a lament psalm. We would then pick it apart with this 4-fold structure of turn, complain, ask, and trust, which serves as a general framework for all laments. And then we would write our own in light of what we saw in the scripture. And so that's what in the back in the appendix is designed to do, is to provide a framework for people to be able to pray their own lament prayers. And what it became was a way for both people to deal with their hurt and the tension of what they feel, like a dam of emotion kind of pent up. It provides a release valve. And it also allowed for other believers to really hear what was going on in the lives of their fellow Christians. And in that respect, it was really, really redemptive. And that's why I use the word triumph. And particularly, I kind of walk through Psalm 94, which is designed to be a psalm protesting injustice. And in fact, it says, can wicked rulers be allied with you, those who frame injustice by statute? So where do you go when you feel like everything's working against you? Lament is a language that helps you survive when it feels like the whole universe is collapsing under the weight of unfairness and brokenness.
Yes, Psalm 94, and of course a number of the other Psalms fit into that category. In the interest of time, let's get into the last one, believe, dare to hope again, because in some respects there is an end point. There is a telos, if you will, and so this is one of those things that you certainly talk about in terms of really coming out on the other side. Talk about that, if you might.
Yeah, the title of the chapter, Dare to Hope, comes from the New Living Bible's translation of Lamentations 3, where it says, I will never forget this awful time, and yet I will still dare to hope. I love that translation because it really captures the risk that's involved with hoping that things are going to change. And as I've engaged with Black brothers and sisters, one of the heavy burdens is just the level of disappointment that they faced, whether it's relationally with particular people or with churches or particular subsets within our society, that you can really get to a place of just utter hopelessness. And what lament does is it invites us to really begin to dare to hope again that God really can bring about change. I mean, when you're looking at an issue that has plagued our country in varying forms and in varying degrees for over 400 years, it'd be really easy to throw your hands up and say, there's no hope. And yet lament is the language that says, I still will believe that God can help me and can change the situation. So it's a call to have people turn their confidence in God so that they can persevere and stay engaged in the conversation.
And to underscore that, I'm holding up now my booklet on racism, and one of the things that we have in there is a research study that was done by the Pew Research Center, which, of course, as you might imagine, found wide differences between black and white adults. But I come to a section where more than 3/4 of African Americans believe that the country hasn't gone far enough in giving blacks equal rights with whites, compared to about 37% of whites. But this was the other one that was even more sobering. About half of all the African Americans actually interviewed in this Pew Research study were convinced that black people will never have equal rights. I mean, that is just a sense of which it is, it is worthless. And it's never going to be one where we will have hope. And so I thought your chapter there really gives us a kind of a biblical perspective that we need to have based upon Lamentations. And like you said, the New Living Translation probably presents it the best of all. Let's, if we can, talk about how to use this book. I've already mentioned that you have a number of appendices as well as other suggested readings and bibliography and the rest. But Mark, you're a pastor. You could speak maybe for a minute to other pastors or Bible fellowship leaders, Bible study leaders, small group leaders. What would you say about how they might be able to use your book?
Well, I hope it'll be a book that spans the gap of the kind of division that this conversation can so easily create. I hope in its tone that people will feel drawn to the conversation instead of repelled, away from it. And I hope that I just would, in my mind, love to see a group of 5 or 6 people at Starbucks or some coffee shop sitting around reading the book and talking about it, and then having dinner together and doing things together relationally. You can't study racial reconciliation as just merely an objective goal. It needs to become part of your relationship dynamic, and it needs to transform your dinner table. It needs to transform your church, depending on what area of the country that you live in and the demographics that are there. And I can imagine elder boards or deacons that would be reading it just to kind of get their heads around, how do we think biblically about a language that it could at least start to have a good conversation. So I hope it'll be helpful to people in all walks of life and in varying places in the spectrum as they attempt to engage in this congregation.
Well, I'm just thrilled that Crossway published the book. I'm certainly grateful for the fact that you won an award on the previous book. You might win another one on this one. And I appreciate you giving us an hour today to talk about the book as it's just been released. And we wanted our listening audience to know more about it. So, Mark, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View, and thank you for writing the book.
Kerby, thank you again for your interest. I really appreciate it.
We are going to take a break, and then tomorrow we will come back to get into a couple of issues in the news. Penna Dexter is going to join me around the round table. We thought it might be good to get into a couple of these issues in the news and also maybe celebrate what I'm pretty sure is going to take place, and that is we are going to actually meet our matching fund. And I'll be honest, I wasn't sure we would be able to do so, but I'm looking at the numbers, so I think those of you that are working right over the next few hours to put us over the top will be able to announce that we've been able to meet the match, and that has been very encouraging at a time when we've had such economic dislocation, not to mention some of the racial issues we've talked about here on this program even today. And so I hope that this would be a source of some encouragement to you. We've got a long way to go. We've got an election that is taking place. We've got a mending of relationships. Economic issues need to be moved on, medical issues, and much, much more. So I hope that you will take the time each day to join us here on Point of View. And if you want to listen to any of these broadcasts again, this one might be one you might want to pass on to someone who is really trying to figure out how can we really be engaged in this area of racial reconciliation. This was a kind of different look at that, and I thought you might benefit from it. So you can go to the website and you can click on that button that says listen and then just send that podcast on to someone else, or you can send them to the YouTube channel and watch some of that as well. So these are some topics we've been addressing, and in the first hour we talked with Bob Lepine about love like you mean it, the heart of a marriage that honors God. This one, of course, Weep With Me, How Lament Opens a Door for Racial Reconciliation. I want to thank Doug for his help engineering today, and Steve for his help as the producer. If you want more information about some of the things we've been talking about, you can find it at the website pointofview.net. If you want to get in on that last few dollars in the matching fund, I think we're still available for that, so you can go to that website, click on that button, and make your donation. We will be back tomorrow right here on Point of View.
The year 2020 has been filled with problems, or let's just call them challenges. Before I get into that, we want to thank you. We just passed the end of our fiscal year, and many stepped up in a very big and sacrificial way, showing just how much they believe that Point of View is needed as we head into the last half of this year. And that's where our new challenge comes in. At the last minute, a friend stepped up with a surprising $50,000 matching challenge, and listeners matched it. But after that, yet another friend, knowing how important this year is, put down another $50,000 challenge, and because we were so close to deadline, said we could extend it just a bit to July 15th. As our nation deals with so many issues, make sure that Point of View can be a strong voice for truth by helping us complete that second match. Double your investment by giving at pointofview.net/time or call 1-800-347-5151. The clock is ticking. Pointofview.net/time. That's TIME. Pointofview.net/time or 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.